Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sam. I'm just going to start off by just going out to recap, really, about the three land reforms, the three components of the land reform in Zimbabwe. The first land reform after independence was the one that was under the Lancaster House Agreement, where Zimbabwe could only acquire land under the willing buyer, willing seller principle. So under this, only the poorest land was offered to the government. But nevertheless, 75,000 families were resettled in the early 1980s. Then, in 2000, there was occupations, popularly known as the Jambanja. These were largely regularized as the A1 program. Each white farm was divided into about 50 pieces, so you'd have 1,000 hectares maybe divided up, and each farm was about 6 hectares of arable land. And on this land was resettled about 146,000 families, and these were mainly the occupiers of that land. Then Zimbabwe decided to partly follow the colonial model and keep some larger farms. White farms were obviously too big, so they were split into about 5 parts under the A2 model, sometimes known as the commercial model. These were allocated by application, and applicants had to prove that they had farming skills and capital, which means that A2 farmers were by definition better off. There was almost no support for these new farmers, who had to fund their farms themselves. The A2 farmers mortgaged their homes. So often one of the spouses would keep their job while the other was on the farm, so they would have something to invest to start off with. And then for the A1 farms, former communal farmers sometimes brought their cattle and implements like ploughs and hoes. Hyperinflation caused serious problems for everybody, I'm sure as you well know, in Zimbabwe. It was during this period that hundreds and thousands of Zimbabweans left and moved down to South Africa. But since the introduction of the rand and the US dollar in 2009, with the formation of the Government of National Unity and the GPA, the economy was transformed, and this hugely boosted the new farmers. Now, this slide shows agricultural production figures published by the World Bank last November. As you can see, 2011 was a good year, but last year there was irregular rains and it reduced production. What this shows is that Zimbabwe's agricultural production has largely returned to the average of the 1990s, before the land reform. Maize is up to 86% of the 1990s production, and tobacco is high and it's still rising. Now, this slide shows who is producing what. The data comes from the Finance Minister, Tendai Biti, and shows that half the maize and 40% of the tobacco is now coming from resettlement farmers. What we are seeing is that resettlement farmers have become the dynamic sector of the economy. If we are to fairly evaluate the land reform farmers, we need to look more closely at the white farmers they replaced. Now, some white farmers were doing spectacularly well, about 270 of them, and these are the ones you always hear about. Some of the others were doing okay. Many were only subsistence farmers, though. The Rhodesian Farmers Union admitted that 30% were bankrupt, surviving only on subsidies. So how are the new farmers doing compared to the previous white farmers? We find that the new farmers are using more of the land than their white predecessors, but are using it not as intensively. Okay. The World Bank, in its report last November, found that land reform farmers are severely undercapitalized, something we also found in our research. And this is not surprising. White farmers were hugely subsidized, while new farmers had to find their own capital and grow through reinvested profits. Land reform is a bootstrap process. This means that the lower levels of technology and more use of land and more use of labour. Finally, I just want to make 3 points about the land reform farmers. First, these are not just subsistence farmers. Of course, all farmers produce most of their own food and sell some of their production. But we see more than 1/3 of these land reform farmers producing primarily for the market. They are now small commercial farmers. This is already the same proportion as those white farmers who were seriously market-oriented. Second, we know that the white farmers in the 1950s and then the first land reform farmers in the 1980s, that it takes a generation, about 20 years, to dominate a farm and to make it really productive. So the land reform farmers are only halfway there to meeting their maximum productivity. Then third, we know that the 2000 occupations were chaotic and sometimes violent, although less violent of those in the 1950s that Joe mentioned earlier. But that leads to a somewhat surprising conclusion. Most of the land reform farmers are smaller A1 farmers with about 6 hectares. Most of the land, they largely occupied their land. And what that means is that the land was taken by people who wanted to farm and were prepared to work hard. The land distribution was not fair, in the sense that it was being allocated randomly or by some sort of bureaucratic point system. Rather, land was taken by people who wanted to farm it, who had a passion for farming. Women played a key role in the occupation, both as leaders and as occupiers in their own right, and they're now becoming successful farmers. It was chaotic, but these have proved to be the people with initiative and imagination who succeeded because they wanted to farm so much that they were willing to fight to get the land. Now I'll hand you back to Joe to look at how the changed shape of the new farming.